Good morning, beloveds. My name is Kirk Freeman, and I serve this congregation as a ministerial intern. 49 years ago, last Saturday, the United States Supreme Court handed down its historic decision in the case of Roe versus Wade, a ruling that to this day has affirmed a pregnant person's constitutional right to have an abortion without undue restrictions. Many here this morning remember a time before the Roe decision. Many here this morning have rallied and marched and fought to secure and protect the rights affirmed by Roe. And many here this morning have vowed that this right will not be taken away. And yet, as we meet this morning, we know all too well that the Supreme Court will likely roll back Roe versus Wade in some significant way in the coming months. If the court fully overturns Roe, as many as 26 states are poised to immediately ban all abortions, or all but those in certain narrow circumstances. Against this backdrop, UUCR, along with many UU congregations across the country, has responded to the call of the UUA's Side with Love organizing team by dedicating this Sunday to the pursuit of reproductive justice, and to consider how we are called into that work as people of faith. The term reproductive justice is used intentionally here, and it has a specific meaning. As a concept, reproductive justice is an intersectional, anti-oppressive framework developed in 1994 by 12 Black women. These women were academics, faith leaders, and activists who recognize that limits on access to abortion are just one way that systems of oppression rooted in power and control work to limit everybody's reproductive autonomy. They also recognize that a fight for abortion rights and women's rights led primarily by middle-class and wealthy white women could not represent the needs of women of color, other marginalized women, or trans people. And so they sought to build a national movement centering the needs of the most marginalized people, families, and communities, recognizing that no body is free unless every body is free. The organizer and activist Suzanne Farr once observed that sexism, racism, and homophobia unite the right and divide the left. That, I believe, is the wisdom of the reproductive justice framework. It sets before us the goal of a future when all people can self-determine their reproductive lives, free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. And it does so by asserting 4 human rights: the right to personal bodily autonomy, the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And so today, yes, we will be talking about abortion in particular. And yes, we will be considering in particular how we might respond as people of faith when the Supreme Court upends 49 years of settled law. And yet at the same time, we also want to invite you to consider how this moment and our response to it is part of a larger struggle for reproductive justice, for bodily autonomy, and for liberation for all. And so to continue this conversation, it is my honor to invite Rena Geibel to share from her experience.
Thank you, Kirk. Good morning. I join you today as a friend of UUCR, an international public health specialist, a childbirth educator, and a childbirth doula. I'm not a doctor, a nurse, or a midwife. I am present to help families with information and emotional and physical support as they prepare and birth their babies. But very early in my career, my aim was focused on the provision of reproductive rights model of care. It was providing accessible education and services. It turns out we didn't do a great job of this. there were huge systemic barriers to accessing safe and equitable care. One of these barriers were being mistreated when seeking that health care. Time and time again, I heard case after case of disrespect. In one instance, Maria was giving birth to her first baby. She was vocalizing loudly as her baby got very low in her birth canal. And the nurse scolded her for making such a noise, slapped her leg, told her to be quiet and push. I was witness to pregnant people being coerced and threatened by healthcare workers or to withhold their care if they didn't behave. In the power dynamics of a provider and a patient, pregnant people, if they were courageous enough to ask a question, I often heard the condescending response, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that. I'll take good care of you." The right to personal bodily autonomy was not upheld. Despite international human rights protections against abuse in a healthcare setting, these stories of mistreatment were prolific. There was no autonomy, limited informed consent, no shared decision-making. So I listened and read and reflected. And finally, in 2010, there was a groundbreaking analysis out of the Harvard School of Public Health demonstrating non-consented care, physical abuse, care without dignity and respect. So the cases that I witnessed were not isolated. So fast forward nearly 10 years to 2019, and women in the United States were surveyed to disclose that 1 in 6 are mistreated in childbirth. And the rates of mistreatment are consistently higher for Indigenous, Brown, and Black people of color. Requests for help, requests that they're in pain are ignored, and laboring people are shouted or scolded at. They feel coerced or threatened into accepting a treatment they don't want. And this follows a long and tainted history in this country of reproductive oppression, forced breeding, forced sterilization, reproductive experimentation, and forced family planning. Phew. And this is just one aspect of reproductive justice, autonomy in the absence of discrimination. And we're still not quite there. Consider other aspects of reproductive justice, social and economic justice, gender equity, the choice to not have a child, affordable childcare, paid parental leave, safe and affordable housing. Can I, a cisgender, white, middle-aged female, be an ally to a person of color in a vulnerable moment such as childbirth? Am I speaking up in real time when I witness a harmful treatment? Am I seeing, am I listening keenly enough? And how can I support that broader reproductive justice movement that was created by those 12 talented Black women? So I made an intentional transition from that larger scale public health work to get closer to families and become a childbirth educator and a birth doula. I guide families as they learn about their options, practice informed decision-making, and I'm by their side as they birth their babies. I am hopeful that I am part of changing this narrative to one filled with respectful care. And in addition, I try to use my experiences to encourage and train birth workers globally to become conscious of dignity and respect, equitable healthcare, and that broader reproductive justice model. And this includes supporting more Black and Brown people of color to become birth workers. And this is where I'll leave you today, just asking you as a people of faith to read, reflect on situations like Maria, to keenly and deeply listen, and consider how you can help the pursuit of reproductive justice in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Okay. When Kirk told me about this service, I mentioned to him that I volunteered for Planned Parenthood some time ago. This was about 33 years ago. I was working full-time, but my girls were away at college. And when my friend asked me to volunteer, I, of course, said yes. They were having trouble getting volunteers because some of the clinics were threatened, some were bombed. But I felt this is something I really and truly believed in and I wanted to do. And I helped out by being what they called a contraceptive counselor. We went over questions with the young women. And I was medical assistant. I even went into the room when they were being examined by the doctor. So it was an unusual place for me to be. I value the medical profession and, of course, the help that was given to these young women. A lot of them were college women and a lot of them were professional women. And I learned a very valuable lesson, not to judge a book by its cover. The women who came in, the young women from college, were dressed like college gals, and other women came in dressed for success. But I learned quickly that the young women from college really knew what they wanted out of life. The answers to their questions were just so different from the other women who were, I would say, more frightened and unsure of what they wanted out of life. But it was a wonderful experience, and I'm sorry that I had to leave that because our Rockville clinic was threatened to the point where they wouldn't take volunteers anymore. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
At the end there was a sign that said, "My body, my mind, my body, my power." And I feel like that sums up the work of reproductive justice so well. Beloveds, we are running a little long this morning, but I hope you will agree that as we face an uncertain future in which the struggle for reproductive autonomy faces almost certain setback, we must wrestle with the important question before us this morning. And that question is, how are we, as a people of faith, called to respond in this moment? You see, I don't believe it's a question of how, I believe it's a question of how we are called to respond. Because as Unitarian Universalists, we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of each person. We affirm that all people should be treated equitably, justly, and with compassion. And we promote the right of conscience and bodily and spiritual autonomy. And we are committed to dismantling systems of oppression in ourselves and in our world. In short, we are people who believe that we can play a role in bending the arc of justice towards history, and that we have a spiritual and moral obligation to do so. But what might that work look like in this moment? First, I believe we must discern how we fit into the broader movement for reproductive justice, both individually and as a community. The thing about the work for reproductive justice is that ultimately it is about collective liberation, and collective liberation can only be attained collectively and collaboratively. This means both that no one person can do everything and that everyone must do something. It also means that for the work to be meaningful, it must be done with intention, in community with, and with a particular concern for the needs of the people who are most impacted. So perhaps your work is to be in the streets, resisting the politics of control that seek to impose limits on who does and who does not have the right to reproductive autonomy. Perhaps your work is to engage in networks of love and care that will tend to the spiritual, physical, financial, and even logistical needs of individuals living in anti-abortion states who will need to travel to areas like DC and Maryland to access the medical care they require and are entitled to. Perhaps your work is to volunteer with or support organizations that expand access to perinatal and postpartum health services and mental health support, or that offer childcare, education, and economic resources, particularly in underserved communities. Beloveds, as we identify our outward and collaborative work, it is important to remember that regardless of what we do, we are doing it as part of the larger movement for reproductive justice. This means that for those of us with privileged identities, rather than trying to solve a problem for someone else, we should instead listen to the experience and look to the leadership of individuals most impacted by reproductive injustice. We should side with love by siding with one another, recognizing that no one is free unless everyone is free. Dear ones, committing ourselves to the broader movement for reproductive justice also requires a commitment to doing the inward work of freeing ourselves from the way that systems of oppression like racism, classism, misogyny, and homophobia are at work within us. This means freeing ourselves and each other from a sense of shame related to reproductive and sexual health and experience. This sense of shame supports reproductive injustice by keeping us silent about a fundamental part of the human experience. This sense of shame prevents us from asking questions, from sharing our stories, from claiming our own reproductive autonomy, and from respecting the reproductive autonomy of others. This sense of shame is rooted in a false narrative that there is one correct way to be an embodied sexual being, and therefore we must be constantly policing ourselves and one another. My colleague and friend, Reverend Rob Keithan, has argued that religious people, including our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors, played an outsized role in establishing this narrative of shame. And therefore, as people of faith, we have an outsized responsibility to resist and counter it. So let us claim this responsibility. And let us do so by also claiming our faith in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and the spiritual necessity to treat one another with equity, justice, and compassion. This morning, we have been blessed by the wisdom and experience of several women. As we've discussed, this is vitally important if we are operating under a framework that calls us to center the experiences of those people most impacted by systems of reproductive injustice. And informed by that framework, it would be more than reasonable for you to be asking why a cisgender heterosexual white male is now offering this concluding reflection. And I assure you that the answer is something other than the fact that Reverend Rebecca sees it as her responsibility as an intern supervisor to encourage her interns to lean into their discomfort. So that is very much true. The reality is that while the work of reproductive justice is rooted in addressing the harm done to the most marginalized and impacted people, it is also a framework that seeks the transformation of our world, a transformation that requires the participation of all of us. So, beloveds, consider this to be a particular invitation to the other cisgender heterosexual white men here to recognize with me that our liberation is also tied up in this movement, and that we have a responsibility to participate in it. Beloveds, there is so much work to be done, and as a person of faith, I believe that we all are called to do it. In the months ahead, our resolve may be tested, but we will also have ample opportunities to rise to the occasion as a people who will not be deterred from siding with love and justice. To that end, I am sharing in the chat a link to additional reproductive justice resources and opportunities for people of faith to get involved in organizing and planning for this uncertain future. This document just scratches the surface, but it is a start. Please also know that Reverend Rebecca and I are each engaging in this work through our collegial and interfaith clergy networks. And if you are interested in exploring how UUCR as a congregation can become more involved in direct action and support for people seeking abortions in a post-Roe versus Wade America, we are eager to work with you. And so, beloveds, as I conclude, I pray that we each find our way to engage in the cause of reproductive justice. And I pray that we all live to experience the day when all people can self-determine their reproductive lives, free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. Amen, and may it be so.